Shalom, everybody. Welcome, everyone. This shiur is about the topic this time is Eruvin, about the Eruv or on halachic mixers. In this shiur, we'll talk about Eruvim, what they are, how they're created, and some practical matters. First, an introduction. The laws of Eruvim are laid out in the laws of Eruvin, also laws of Yom Tov, chapter 6, and definitions are scattered along the laws of Shabbat and the laws of Sukkah also, because there's various concepts that are introduced in different parts of the Mishneh Torah. The word Eruv has as its root the verb Ein Resh Bet, which has the meaning of mixing. An Eruv is a rabbinic enactment which, so to speak, mixes together things which, though they're permitted by Torah law, might lead to confusion and possible transgression because people might be led to believe the Torah prohibition is permitted. That's not very explanatory, so let's dig in. Types of Eruv. The kinds of Eruv are an Eruv Haserot, which is a mixing of individual houses and courtyards, which enables carrying on Shabbat from house to house. Likewise, a shituf is a similar thing to Eruv Haserot, but that intermixes houses in an alley. These both can be extended to encompass an entire city, and they are what's commonly referred to as just the Eruv. Another kind of an Eruv is called an Eruv Tahumim, which is a mixing of the city limits with the rabbinically prohibited area beyond them, which permits walking more than 2,000 amah past those rabbinic limits. A third kind of Eruv is an Eruv Tavshilin, which again is a mixing of food preparation, which permits a person to cook for Shabbat during a Yom Tov, which is right before Shabbat. So how are they defined? Start with the Eruv Tavshilin. The Eiruv Tavshilin is defined as not less than a kazait worth of food, and to know what a kazait is, see the shiur on olives, whether for a single person or for thousands of people. This kind of an Eiruv may not be made with bread or fruit and so forth, but rather it must be made of a cooked dish, which would accompany bread, such as fish, meat, or eggs, and so forth. This is brought in the laws of Yom Tov, chapter 6, Halacha 3. This kind of an Eruv must exist the entire time it affects, in other words, Friday, until all the cooking, for Shabbat, for example, or the second day of Yom Tov, is finished. So you create this, an Eruv Tavshilin is created before Yom Tov, and it permits one to continue cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbat. Normally, you wouldn't be permitted to do that, and that prohibition of cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbat is a rabbinic prohibition, and therefore the Eruv Tavshilin is a rabbinic enactment permitting one to, so to speak, violate the rabbinic prohibition if one does the Eruv Tavshilin properly. Similarly, an Eruv Tahumin, it's created by leaving 2 meals worth of food, and a meal's worth is defined as a grogeret per person per meal, and again, see the shiur on olives. You leave 2 meals worth of food within the Shabbat limits. In other words, as far as a person is permitted to go during Shabbat from their location, in the direction one wishes to move on Shabbat. And this is covered by the laws of Eruvin, chapter 6, Halacha 1. By doing this, he can move 2,000 amah from the place he left the food on Shabbat. But this kind of Eruv can only be done for the purpose of fulfilling a mitzvah which must be done on Shabbat. In other words, to attend a wedding meal or something like that. And that's also covered in the same halachot. Now, the most common variety of Eruv, and what people mean usually when they say Eruv without specifying anything else, is the Eruv Haserot or the Shituf. And generally, they just call it an Eruv. In fact, I assume most people don't know the difference. What it is, it's a bit more complex than the other two kinds of Eruvin. The most important thing to keep in mind is that this sort of an Eruv can only be made between a private domain, I'll call it a PD from now on, and either another private domain or what's known as a Carmelite. Okay, it cannot be made between a public domain and between a private domain and a public domain. That's because the Torah prohibits carrying between those two domains. It's a Torah prohibition. Whereas a Carmelite is a variety of domain which the rabbis instituted and which they prohibited carrying from a private domain into or vice versa, because it resembles the public domain. So a Carmelite is not a public domain, and under Torah law, it would be permitted to carry into it from a private domain or from a public domain. But because it resembles the public domain and it's difficult to distinguish between the two, the rabbis prohibited carrying into a Carmelite. And then the institution of Eiruv, Hatzerot, or Shituf was created to permit people to carry between a private domain and another private domain, or a private domain in a Carmelite. And the ultimate purpose of the Eiruv is to make it clear to the person that what they're doing is something that is specifically permitted if they do this, and that it's not permitted to do this to a public domain. Now, the exact definitions of the various kinds of domains are all presented in Laws of Shabbat 14.4 and onward, and we're not going to explain them in detail here. In fact, we're not going to explain them at all here. So among the requirements of an Eiruv are, firstly, it may not mix a private and a public domain. Second, the area affected must be enclosed by a fence, and we'll explain what a fence is, to distinguish it from other areas. And the inhabitants of the Eiruv area must give permission to participate in it. So we'll cover these in a little more detail. A public domain is, among other things, any through road of at least 16 amot wide, which isn't covered. Okay? 16 amot is approximately 26 feet or 8 meters. So any through road, which means not a dead end road, in our cities or towns, which is more than about 8 meters or 26 and a quarter feet wide, is by definition a public domain according to Torah law. This is an extremely important point. Thus, it cannot be included within an Eiruv. The fact that one commonly sees Eiruvs in large cities, which enclose major roads, let alone ordinary roads, is based upon an interpretation of Rashi's, that a public domain requires the passage of 600,000 people per day. Of course, that's not Rambam's definition, nor is it in either of the Talmudim. In fact, the story in Bavli Pesachim 66a regarding bringing a knife on Shabbat Pesach illustrates that Jerusalem streets back in the day were considered a public domain. And the definition of enclosed by a fence means that the area in common, in other words, the area which is enclosed by the Eiruv, must be surrounded by something which has the appearance of a barrier or enclosure. Any openings must have surat petah, which means form of a doorway. In other words, something that looks like it could be a doorway. And Rambam defines that as a rod on one side, a rod on the other side, and a rod on top. So 2 rods for each side of the door, and a rod on top for the lintel. And this is covered in Laws of Sukkah for Halacha 2. The doorway, so to speak, I'm putting these in quotes because they're not really doorways, they're not really gates, but they're intended to perform to appear as if they were. The doorway needs to be strong enough to have an actual door hung on it, even if it's only made of straw. But note the language, a rod on top. In other words, a self-supporting top part, as opposed to the wire which is used commonly, which cannot support its own weight. Inhabitants' permission, what's this mean? It means that everyone participating in the Eiruv must give their permission to be included in it. If even one resident of a courtyard didn't participate in the Eiruv, then the Eiruv is invalid. And this is covered in Laws of Eiruvin 2:1. Similarly, if a Gentile is among the residents, the Eiruv is invalid unless the residents rent his property from him for the duration of the Eiruv. If a Jew who transgresses Shabbat in public or is an idolater is among the residents, he has the legal status of a Gentile, and the other residents must rent from him as well. However, if that Jew is a denier of oral law, in other words, he doesn't even admit the existence of the notion, the concept of Eruvim, then he's not treated as a Gentile, but rather as a complete foreigner, and the residents cannot rent his property. Rather, he must nullify his claim on the property to a kosher Jew, again, just for the duration of the Eiruv. If these have not been done, the Eiruv is invalid. Okay, on to practical matters. Since we, in modern times, in modern cities, at least in Israel, are never asked to participate in an Eiruv, nor do we properly address Gentile ownership of property within the Eiruv area, nor do we properly address secular Jews owning property in the area, nor do we have a proper fence enclosing any Eruvim because, again, the wire that's on top does not constitute the form of a doorway. And most problematic is that we enclose Torah-defined public domains within the Eruvim. So our current Eruvim in almost all locations are clearly not valid. And I say this with sadness because it would be easy to change this. When I asked a prominent rabbi how we can use such Eruvim when they don't adhere to any of the criteria listed in Mishneh Torah or the Talmudim, he said, quote, "You're permitted to be more strict." And, quote, "There are no Torah public domains in our cities. That's clearly wrong." And that the wire on top is leniency, which is also applied to mixed vines. And I tried to find a reference to this, but I couldn't find it, though, as I say, I did not research it intensively. And finally, he said, "We rent the courtyards from the mayor of the city." And the question is, how does the mayor have any authority whatsoever to buy or sell or rent our properties without our explicit consent? The conclusion that I reach is that rather than say people today haven't the strength to obey the rabbinic institution of the Eiruv, and so we essentially ignore it, they make up fictional explanations for how these Eruvim are legitimate when they clearly are not. May God have mercy on us for obeying such Torah leaders.